This story is titled, Cousin Refused to Help Me When I Was Sick, so I stopped paying his rent. Now he's panicking. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Alright, so let me set the stage here. I'm 28 male, living in a pretty decent one-bedroom apartment in the city. I've been here for about 5 years now, working a stable job that pays well enough to afford my own place without stressing over bills. My cousin Jake, 25 male, moved in with me 3 years ago. And honestly, I never thought I'd end up sharing my space for that long. Let me explain how this all started. Jake and I grew up in the same small town near Omaha. If you've never lived in a place like that, it's hard to describe the culture. It's tight-knit, super community-focused, the kind of place where neighbors still borrow sugar from each other and family gatherings aren't optional. When you're from a town like ours, helping family isn't just encouraged, it's expected. Anyway, 3 years ago, Jake called me out of the blue. He had just graduated from college and wanted to move to the city to pursue photography. He sounded excited, full of plans, and honestly, I was impressed. It's not every day someone decides to chase their dreams instead of getting stuck in some dead-end office job. He told me he didn't have a job lined up yet and couldn't afford a place to stay, but he just needed a couple of months to get on his feet. I didn't even think twice. I said, yeah, come on over. Stay as long as you need. I wasn't really worried about it at the time. I mean, I had a decent job, lived alone, and wasn't hurting for cash. Plus, Jake was family. If I couldn't help him out, who would? A week later, Jake showed up at my place with 2 huge suitcases stuffed with clothes, camera gear, and a stack of photography books. He didn't bring much else. No furniture, no groceries, not even a sleeping bag. It was just him and his dream. At first, it was actually kind of nice having him around. We hadn't lived together since we were kids, but we always got along back then. He was the kind of kid who was always tinkering with something, always curious, always full of energy. When he moved in, it felt like having a little piece of home with me in the city. Jake set up shop on my couch. He kept all his stuff in one corner of the living room and promised he wouldn't be in my way. This is temporary, he'd say, just until I land a gig. I believed him. For the first couple of months, things were fine. Jake was constantly out and about, hustling for work. He was sending out his portfolio, networking with other photographers, and even picking up the occasional gig-shooting birthday parties or engagement photos. At night, we'd hang out, watch movies, and catch up on all the small-town gossip I'd missed since moving away. It was actually kind of fun. But then, months turned into more months, and Jake started to settle in a little too much. He wasn't out hustling as much anymore. Instead, he was spending his days scrolling through Instagram, watching YouTube tutorials, and planning his next big move. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just in a slump. Around this time, I noticed I was footing more of the bill than I'd expected. I was paying for rent, utilities, groceries, pretty much everything. Jake would pitch in occasionally, but only when I explicitly asked. Even then, it wasn't much. If we ordered takeout, he'd offer to pay, but only for his portion. If I bought groceries, he'd say, I'll get the next round, and then conveniently forget. Still, I didn't say anything. I wanted to believe that Jake was just taking his time to figure things out. I mean, chasing a creative career isn't easy, right? I figured he'd hit his stride eventually. Then one day, Jake told me he was close to landing a big break. He said he just needed a solid portfolio to show potential clients, but he didn't have the money to rent the props or studio space he needed. I didn't even hesitate. I handed him $500 out of my savings and told him to go for it. Looking back, I probably should have set some boundaries then. Over the next year, Jake's big break never came. He got a few gigs here and there, but nothing steady. He started getting frustrated, and honestly, I was frustrated too. I wanted to see him succeed, but I couldn't help but feel like he wasn't trying as hard as he could. To help him out, I used one of my connections to land him a part-time job at a local cafe. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something to keep him afloat while he worked on his photography. He lasted 2 weeks before he quit, saying, I can't pour coffee for the rest of my life, man. I've got bigger things ahead. I was torn. On one hand, I admired his commitment to his dreams. On the other hand, I couldn't understand why he wasn't willing to put in the work to support himself in the meantime. But again, I let it slide. Here's the thing. I didn't just support Jake financially. I went out of my way to help him in every possible way. When he needed new editing software, I bought it for him. When he wanted to set up a YouTube channel, I helped him write captions and video descriptions. I spent hours brainstorming ideas with him, trying to figure out how to market his work. And through it all, I didn't expect anything in return. A simple thank you was enough for me. But as time went on, I started to notice something. Jake wasn't just leaning on me for support. He was taking me for granted. Anytime I asked for a favor, he acted like it was a chore. If I needed help carrying groceries or moving furniture, he'd groan and complain. At one point, I realized he'd taken over my bedroom. I was spending most of my time at my girlfriend Liza's place, so I wasn't using it much. But still, it was my room. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said, "Well, you're never here anyway." I didn't argue. I didn't want to rock the boat. But deep down, I knew something had to change. I didn't wake up one day and suddenly decide Jake was freeloading. It was more like a slow realization. At first, I brushed off the small annoyances. After all, family is family, right? But the thing about small cracks is that they spread, and before you know it, the whole foundation is shaky. It started with Jake's attitude. When he first moved in, he'd constantly talk about how grateful he was and how he'd repay me once he got on his feet. But as time went on, those thank yous turned into jokes, sarcastic ones. Anytime I asked him for something, he'd roll his eyes or make a snarky comment. "Wow, you actually need me for something? Shocking." Stuff like that. At first, I laughed along, but it started to sting after a while. For example, one time I asked him to drop off my dry cleaning because it was on his way to a gig. He acted like I'd asked him to carry my laundry on foot across the city. "Man, I've got a busy day ahead. Can't you just pick it up yourself?" Never mind that I'd been paying his rent, utilities, and groceries for over a year. And then there was the flat tire incident. I was out with Liza, and we were coming back from a movie night when my car broke down. It was late, and I didn't want Liza waiting around for an Uber in a sketchy part of town. I called Jake, figuring he'd swing by since he wasn't doing anything. I'd literally seen him post an Instagram story from my apartment earlier. His response? "Ugh, I'm not a cab service, dude. Why don't you just call an Uber? You know how far this is for me?" The thing is, it wasn't even that far, 12 miles max. But his tone hit me like a slap. I remember thinking, would it kill you to help me out for once? Around this time, I started spending most of my nights at Liza's place. It wasn't intentional at first. We were just enjoying each other's company. But over time, it became easier to avoid the tension back at my apartment. The thing is, I was still paying for everything there. Rent, utilities, internet, even the Netflix account Jake used daily. And what was he contributing? Nothing. I'll admit, part of me felt guilty. I kept telling myself, he's family. He's trying to make it in a tough industry. But even when I tried to justify it, I couldn't ignore the way he treated me. One weekend, Liza and I went furniture shopping. We ended up buying a chair, and since it was too bulky to fit in my car, we had to arrange for shipping. The delivery fee was ridiculous, so I called Jake to see if he could help us transport it. He answered the phone sounding annoyed, as usual, and when I asked, he groaned, "I just did leg day yesterday, man. My quads are killing me. Can't you guys just pay for delivery?" This was the kind of stuff that drove me nuts. He wasn't working that day, wasn't busy with anything important, but still made a fuss about helping out. Eventually, he did show up, but the whole time he acted like he was doing us the biggest favor in the world. Liza noticed it too and later said, "Does he always act like this when you ask for help?" I didn't know how to answer because honestly, I'd let it slide so many times that it felt normal. The breaking point came when I got sick. I don't mean a mild cold. I mean full-blown flu, fever, chills, the works. I was miserable and running out of supplies. Liza was working late, so I called Jake and asked him to grab me some soup and meds. I knew he was home because, once again, I'd seen him live on Instagram not 10 minutes earlier. He picked up the phone and sighed like I'd just asked him to solve world hunger. "Dude, I'm kinda busy right now. Can't you just wait until Liza gets off work?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, "I'm sick, Jake. I just need you to pick up a few things and drop them off. It's not a big deal." And do you know what he said? "I'm not your nurse, man. Handle your own stuff." I was furious. I couldn't even argue because I felt so weak, so I just hung up. I ended up dragging myself to the store to get what I needed, and when Liza came home, I told her what happened. She was livid. "You're still paying for that apartment, right? And he can't even do this one thing for you?" She wasn't wrong. The worst part wasn't even Jake's lack of effort. It was his lack of respect. By this point, it was clear that he didn't see me as someone who was helping him. He saw me as someone he could use, and that realization stung more than I care to admit. Over the next few days, I started thinking about how much I'd sacrificed for Jake. I'd put my own comfort, finances, and peace of mind on the line for him. And for what? A sarcastic roommate who couldn't be bothered to lift a finger when I needed him? Liza suggested I move in with her and let Jake take over the lease. It sounded like a clean solution, but I wasn't ready for that step. Our relationship was still new, and I didn't want to rush things. Plus, deep down, I didn't trust Jake to handle the rent on his own. Instead, I decided it was time to confront him. I told Jake how I felt, that I was hurt by the way he treated me and that I didn't feel appreciated. His response? Defensive as hell. He started listing all the favors he'd done for me over the years, like that one time he helped me carry groceries or dropped off a pen drive at my office. You act like I've done nothing for you, he said, but I'm not your butler, man. I couldn't believe it. I reminded him of everything I'd done for him, taking him in, paying his bills, helping him build his portfolio, and covering for him when he didn't have enough money to get by. He shrugged it off and said, "You offered, remember? Don't act like I begged you." That was it. I was done. I didn't know exactly how I was going to handle it, but I knew one thing for sure. Jake couldn't keep living rent-free in my apartment. It was time for a change. After my conversation with Jake, I realized something important. No matter how much you care about someone, there comes a point where you have to put yourself first. It wasn't just about money or convenience anymore. It was about self-respect. For 3 years, I'd been bending over backward to make Jake's life easier, and he couldn't even be bothered to show basic appreciation. But even though I'd made up my mind to change things, I hesitated. The idea of confronting Jake again filled me with dread. Part of me still felt responsible for him, even though I knew I shouldn't. I couldn't shake the thought, what if I cut him off, and he really can't make it on his own? I sat down with Liza that night to talk it through. She listened patiently, and then she said something that stuck with me. You've given Jake more than enough time and support. If he's not ready to stand on his own now, that's on him, not you. She was right. I'd been making excuses for Jake for years, and all it had done was enable him. It was time to stop. The next day, I started packing up my things at the apartment. Most of my essentials were already at Liza's place, but I still had clothes, books, and some sentimental stuff at my old apartment. When I showed up, Jake was sprawled on the couch scrolling through his phone. He didn't even look up when I walked in. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm going to grab some of my stuff today." Jake just shrugged. "Cool, do whatever." I could feel my frustration bubbling up, but I kept it together. I started packing quietly, hoping to avoid a scene. But as I was boxing up my books, I noticed something. Jake had started using my bedroom as his personal studio. My desk was covered in photography gear, my chair had been replaced with a folding stool, and there were backdrops hanging from the walls. I stood there for a minute, staring at the mess. It wasn't just the physical intrusion that bothered me, it was the audacity of it. He hadn't asked, hadn't even mentioned it. He'd just taken over, as if he had every right. "Jake!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He finally looked up. "What? Why is all your stuff in my room?" He waved his hand dismissively. "You're never here, man. It's not a big deal." I clenched my jaw. "It's still my room. You could have at least asked." Jake rolled his eyes. "Dude, relax. It's just temporary." That word, temporary, hit me like a slap. It was the same word he'd used when he first moved in, promising to stay only until he got on his feet. 3 years later, he was still here, still making excuses, still taking advantage of my generosity. I didn't argue with him then. Instead, I finished packing and left. But on my way back to Liza's place, I made a decision. I was done. No more excuses, no more leniency. That night, I called my landlord. I told him I was moving out and gave him my official 1-month notice. I explained that Jake had been living in the apartment and might want to take over the lease, but if he couldn't, that was his problem. The landlord sounded surprised but agreed to handle it. The next morning, I called Jake. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "We need to talk about the apartment." Jake sounded distracted, like he was barely paying attention. "What about it?" "I'm moving out," I said. "I've already notified the landlord. If you want to stay, you'll need to take over the lease." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Jake said, "Wait, what? You're moving out? Why?" "I can't keep paying for a place I'm not living in," I replied. "It doesn't make sense anymore. You've been here long enough to figure things out, so it's time for you to take over." Jake's tone shifted immediately. "Dude, I can't afford the rent on my own. How am I supposed to stay here?" "That's something you'll need to figure out," I said. "You've had 3 years to get on your feet." I've done more than enough to help you. Jake didn't take it well. He started listing all the reasons why he couldn't afford the apartment. His gigs weren't steady, the rent was too high, he didn't have anyone else to rely on. He even tried to guilt trip me, saying, "What if things don't work out with Liza? Going to need this place to come back to." That last part really pissed me off. It wasn't just manipulative, it was selfish. Jake wasn't thinking about me or my needs. He was only thinking about himself and how my decision would affect him. "I'll take my chances," I said firmly. "I'm done paying for this place. If you can't afford it, you'll need to move out." He kept arguing, but I didn't budge. Eventually, he hung up on me. Over the next few days, I started clearing out the rest of my stuff. Each time I went back to the apartment, Jake tried a different tactic to change my mind. One day, he acted apologetic, saying, "Bro, I didn't realize how much this was bothering you. I'm sorry, okay? Let's just go back to how things were." Another day, he tried to guilt trip me again, saying, "I looked up to you, man. I thought you were someone I could count on. But I didn't fall for it. I knew if I gave in, nothing would change." The final straw came when I called a moving company to pick up my furniture. Jake watched as the movers carried out my couch, my desk, my bed, everything I'd left behind. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. As I loaded the last box into my car, Jake finally spoke up. "So, this is it?" "Yeah," I said. "This is it." He nodded slowly, then muttered, "I guess I'll figure it out." I didn't respond. I just got in my car and drove away. A few weeks after I officially moved out, the calls from Jake started coming in. At first, he was trying to play it cool. "Hey, just checking in. How's everything at Liza's?" It was painfully transparent. He wasn't calling to chat. He wanted to talk about the apartment. I could sense the unease in his voice, but I wasn't about to bring it up for him. I let him circle around the topic like a nervous teenager. Finally, after some awkward small talk, he got to the point. "So, the landlord's been, a little uptight lately," Jake said. "He keeps asking about the rent. I told him you're the one who always handled that." I sighed. "Jake, I already told you. When I moved out, I handed over everything to the landlord. He knows you're the tenant now. If there's an issue, you need to deal with it." Jake let out this long, dramatic sigh, like I'd just told him I was sending him to the gallows. "But I can't cover it, man. You know I don't have that kind of money." I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. "Jake, you've been living there for free for 3 years? I gave you every opportunity to get your stuff together. If you can't make it work now, that's on you." A few days later, Jake showed up unannounced at Liza's place. I was sitting on the couch, going over some work emails, when the doorbell rang. Liza opened it, and there he was, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was a mess, his shirt was wrinkled, and he had this desperate look in his eyes. "I need to talk to you," he said, barely glancing at Liza. She stepped aside reluctantly, letting him in. Jake sat down on the edge of the couch, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "The landlord locked me out," he blurted. "He says I'm 2 months behind on rent, and he's threatening to sell my stuff if I don't pay up. I don't know what to do." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "What do you want me to do about it?" Jake's eyes widened, like he couldn't believe I wasn't immediately offering to save him. "You could talk to him. Explain the situation. He might listen to you." I shook my head. "Jake, I'm not getting involved. You signed the lease. This is your responsibility now." He started to panic, his voice rising. "But he's going to take my camera, my laptop, everything I need to work. You can't just let that happen." "Jake," I said, trying to stay calm, "you've had 3 years to figure this out. I can't keep bailing you out every time something goes wrong. It's time for you to handle your own problems." Over the next week, Jake's texts and calls became relentless. He went from apologizing to accusing to full-on begging. He sent long messages about how he'd always admired me and how he never meant to take advantage of me. But then, in the same breath, he'd say things like, "I can't believe you're turning your back on family." It was exhausting. Meanwhile, I got a call from the building manager at my old apartment. He told me Jake had been throwing loud parties after I moved out, complete with blaring music and trashed common areas. The neighbors had complained multiple times, and the manager had given Jake several warnings. That, combined with his failure to pay rent, was the final straw for the landlord. When I confronted Jake about it, he acted like it was no big deal. "Yeah, I had a few people over," he admitted, "but it's not like I trashed the place. The landlord's just being a jerk." I couldn't believe how delusional he sounded. "Jake, you're the one who's 2 months behind on rent. He has every right to kick you out." Jake just shrugged, like the whole situation was out of his hands. A couple of days later, Jake called me in tears. He said he'd been sleeping in the subway for the past 3 nights because he had nowhere else to go. He kept saying, "I don't know how this happened. I feel like everything's falling apart." I tried to stay empathetic, but it was hard. "Jake, this didn't just happen. You had years to get your life together. You ignored every opportunity to take responsibility, and now you're dealing with the consequences." He sniffled, his voice trembling. "You're really not going to help me? After everything we've been through?" "I already helped you," I said firmly. "More than I should have. This is your mess to clean up now." The last straw came when Jake tried to rope Liza into the situation. He showed up at her place while I was at work, begging her to let him crash on our couch just for a week. Liza, bless her, didn't sugarcoat her response. "Jake, no offense, but I've seen how this plays out," she said. "A week turns into months, and before you know it, we're stuck in the same cycle. I'm sorry, but you need to figure this out on your own." When I got home and she told me about it, I was furious. Not at Liza. She did exactly what I would have done. But at Jake for trying to drag her into this. It felt like a new low, even for him. A few days later, Jake called me one last time. He was frantic, saying the landlord had confiscated his camera, laptop, and other valuables to cover the unpaid rent. He begged me to help him get them back, saying they were his only shot at getting back on his feet. I'll admit, part of me felt sorry for him. That camera was his pride and joy. He treated it like an extension of himself. But I also knew that stepping in would just prolong the inevitable. "I'm sorry, Jake," I said. "I can't help you. This is something you need to handle yourself." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I guess this is it, huh?" "Yeah," I replied. "I guess it is." That was the last time we spoke for a while. I heard through the grapevine that he managed to recover his camera and laptop thanks to our uncle, who bailed him out. But the landlord wouldn't let him stay, and he couldn't afford the rent anyway. Last I heard, he was couch surfing with friends and working under a wedding photographer. As for me, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I didn't like how things ended, but I knew it was the right decision. Sometimes you have to let people fail so they can learn to stand on the period. After Jake moved out of my life, both figuratively and literally, I thought the drama would end. When you grow up in a small-town family like ours, everyone has opinions about your business, whether they should or not. News of Jake's eviction and our fallout traveled fast, and before I knew it, I was getting phone calls from relatives asking what was going on. The first call came from my dad. He was calm about it, but I could tell he'd already heard Jake's side of the story. "Your uncle called me," he started. "He says Jake's out on the streets because you refused to help him. What's going on, son?" I was annoyed but not surprised. Jake had always been good at playing the victim. I took a deep breath and explained everything. The rent, the freeloading, the parties, the landlord's warnings, the 3 years of ungrateful behavior. I didn't sugarcoat anything, but I didn't embellish either. By the end of the conversation, my dad let out a long sigh. "Sounds like you did more than enough for him," he said. "Your uncle's upset, but honestly, that's because Jake ran to him for help. Don't let them guilt you into anything." Not long after that, my uncle called me directly. Unlike my dad, he wasn't calm. The minute I picked up, he launched into a tirade about how I'd abandoned Jake when he needed me most. "How could you just throw him out?" he demanded. "He's your cousin, for God's sake. Family is supposed to look out for each other." I let him rant for a bit before cutting him off. "Uncle Kyle," I said, trying to stay calm, "I didn't throw Jake out. He had 3 years to get his act together, and he didn't. I paid for everything. His rent, his food, his career, and all I got in return was disrespect. If you think he needs more help, then by all means, help him yourself." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well," he muttered, "he's staying with me now, but you could have handled it better." I didn't have the energy to argue. "Maybe," I said, "but I'm done enabling him." Meanwhile, Jake continued to reach out, this time through mutual friends. He told them I'd abandoned him and left him to fend for himself in a city where he had no support. A few of them messaged me, asking if it was true. At first, I felt defensive. I wanted to explain my side of the story to everyone, but then I realized I didn't owe anyone an explanation. The people who truly knew me understood what I'd been through with Jake, and honestly, if someone believed his sob story without hearing my side, they weren't worth my time. Jake's situation with Uncle Kyle didn't last long. Within a month, I heard through my dad that Jake had overstayed his welcome there too. Uncle Kyle had bailed him out by helping him retrieve his camera and laptop from the landlord, but Jake had no plans to pay him back. He also wasn't contributing to household expenses, which led to a blow-up between them. Apparently, Uncle Kyle told Jake he needed to start pulling his weight or find somewhere else to stay. Jake, being Jake, took this as a personal attack and decided to leave. He ended up couch surfing with a friend from college, bouncing from place to place while trying to pick up gigs as a wedding photographer. I'll admit, I felt a small pang of sympathy when I heard about it, but it was quickly overshadowed by frustration. Jake wasn't homeless because the world had conspired against him. He was homeless because he refused to take responsibility for his life. One day, out of nowhere, I got a message from Jake. It was short and to the point. "I'm sorry for how things turned out. I hope we can move past this someday." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. My response was just as short. "I hope you figure things out." It wasn't the heartfelt reconciliation he might have been hoping for, but I wasn't ready to let him back into my life. Not yet. Maybe not ever. At this point, my focus shifted back to my own life. Moving in with Liza had been a big step, and I wanted to make sure our relationship was solid. She'd been my rock throughout all the Jake drama, and I didn't want to take that for granted. We started talking more about our future, what we wanted, where we saw ourselves in a few years. It felt good to finally be in a partnership where both people contributed equally. Meanwhile, I took some time to reflect on the lessons I'd learned from my experience with Jake. The biggest one? Helping someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. It's one thing to lend a hand when someone's in need, but it's another to let them take advantage of your kindness. For 3 years, I let Jake walk all over me because I thought that's what family was supposed to do. But family isn't about enabling bad behavior. It's about mutual respect and support, something Jake had never given me. A few months later, I ran into one of our mutual friends at a coffee shop. She mentioned that Jake was finally starting to turn things around. He'd landed a semi-steady gig with a wedding photography company and was even thinking about renting a room with some co-workers. "He seems different now," she said. "More grounded. Maybe everything he went through was a wake-up call." I nodded, unsure how to feel. On one hand, I was glad he was making progress. On the other hand, I couldn't forget how much I'd gone through because of him. To this day, I'm not sure if Jake and I will ever fully reconcile. Part of me hopes we can rebuild our relationship someday, but it would take a lot for me to trust him again. In the meantime, I've learned to set boundaries, not just with Jake, but with everyone in my life. If there's one thing I've taken away from all this, it's that kindness isn't weakness. It's okay to help people, but it's also okay to say enough when they start taking advantage of you.